Good evening, everyone. Nicholas Berry here, and I'm going to be talking to you guys about the social scientific perspective on the New Testament, or addressing New Testament interpretation from a social scientific critique. All right. So originally, this method was introduced around the late 70s, early 80s, and it really desires to address a text from the questions relating to sociology, which are how did the world around the text interact, social or cultural anthropology, so what did it mean to be human, and what did it mean to be human in relationship to others. Third question is psychology. What ideology or ideologies served as the underlying framework for thinking and existing? And so the main presupposition is that the New Testament is a product not just of historical conditioning, but of social and cultural conditioning as well. So when we approach the text, we need to be sure that we're considering these things. How did the world interact? What was going through the mind of the author? What was going through the mind potentially of the audience? And how did everything relate? Again, the method itself was brought about in the late 70s and into the 80s, and then has really developed in the decades since then. It is accredited to some of the work by Peter Berger and Thomas Luckman in the late 70s on their work on the sociology of knowledge. And a lot of that framework dealt with some of the beginning questions of how can we, after we've understood narrative criticism, how can we really understand the text better? And the questions were answered with the social scientific method. All right, so by 1981, John Eliot comes onto the scene in his ideas of sociological exegesis, which he defined as the questions asking not only what a text said then and there, but also how and why the text was designed to function and how it impacted the life and activity of its recipients and formulators. And so that's the definition that I really want to posit tonight, is that sociological exegesis, or the social scientific method, not only asks what a text said then and there, but how and why that text was designed to function and how it impacted the life and activity of its recipients and formulators. Some big questions to ask there. Howard Key came along in 1989 and posited 7 categories of questions, and I don't have time to really get into them, but if you can reference his work, Knowing the Truth, published in 1989, you'll find he addresses these 7 categories, and those are boundary questions, authority questions, status and role questions, ritual questions, literary questions with social implications, questions about group function, and questions concerning the symbolic universe and the social construction of reality. Now, I know that's a lot to really consider for a short video, but these are the main types of questions that sociology tries to answer in the world, and they really do come into play with our studies in the New Testament especially. So think about some of those questions as we begin to address the text of 1 Corinthians 13. Now, a few contemporary contributions have been made by my personal favorite, Ben Witherington III, who developed a socio-rhetorical commentary. Well, it was in part of the commentary series published by Eerdmans, but he wrote 4 of the works within the 10-volume series. He wrote on the Acts of the Apostles, conflict and community in Corinth, the letters to Philemon, Colossians, and Ephesians, and 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. If you get a chance, read the socio-rhetorical commentary series. It will change your life, especially the works by Ben Witherington. A few of the other contributors that I'll mention are Molina with his social scientific commentary series, Nares, The Social World of the New Testament and of Luke and Acts, and then all the works published through T&T Clark. They've done a lot in the world of social scientific approaches to New Testament interpretation. I highly recommend those works. So let's look at 1 Corinthians 13. I'm going to read through it with you guys, and then we're going to talk a little bit about it. And it reads, "If I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have prophetic words and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. If I give away all that I have, and if I deliver my body up to be burned, but have not love, I gain nothing. Love is patient and kind. Love does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, and endures all things." In verses 8 through 13, love never ends. As for prophecies, they will pass away. For tongues, they will cease. For knowledge, it will pass away. For we know in part and we prophesy in part, but when the perfect comes, the partial will pass away. When I was a child, I spoke as a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. But when I became a man, I put away childish ways. For now we see through a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I have been fully known. So now faith, hope, and love abide, these three, but the greatest of these is love. Amen. So let's look at the social and historical background of Corinth. At the time when Paul wrote to the Corinthians, the city itself had been destroyed earlier in 146 BC by the Romans and had since then been rebuilt. And in the rebuilding, it was maintained and lived in by the Romans, and it's often mentioned that a lot of the Roman veterans would have been given some of these houses to live in as a thank you to their services in the army. So the city itself had been destroyed and rebuilt and had become so heavily influenced by Roman culture that the new Corinth was often identified as Roman Corinth. So, secondly, the city's geographical location made it a prime location for trade and commerce, and especially with the main production and manufacturing of Corinthian brass. They were well known for their production in this area, and that gave them a sense of high civic and individual pride. As the time went on, boasting of pride became a form of art for them. They were living in an honor and shame culture, and it's no doubt that those were the same things that bled into the church. And as we remember the beginning chapters of 1 Corinthians, we see Paul retorting to these issues that he had been made known to, of them saying, look, you're of one apostle, I'm of another, I'm the higher tribe, or I'm the higher group. There was a lot of that elitism in the Corinthian church that Paul was trying to address. So this gives some of the background into their mindset of how divided they would have been by nature living in such an honor-shame society. So let's look a little bit more about the Corinthian Christians. We don't know much about them outside of 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 26 and 28, where Paul states that not many to whom he is writing are wise, powerful, or of noble birth, which shows that not many of them were, but some of them may have been, which gives the idea that there may have been this high, status and consistency where some had a high social status in one area, but may have had a lower social status in another area, which could very well have played into their role in the church, especially when you speak about their finances. So, along with the high social status and consistency, there was also a really large dynamic gap in their economic structure and in the wealth of the social groups. So what you saw in Corinth would have been, a lot of them would have been, or those who were of noble birth or were of rule or high social status, they would have been the wealthy ones. They would have been very affluent, and those were the ones who could afford the houses to live in where they would have housed the churches and the fellowship meetings. So what ended up happening was those members of the high social status and high wealth would give, and it's noble to give, and they would give to the poor, and they would give to the church, and things like that. But what ended up happening was the rich got richer, and the poor remained poor. They were thankful for what they had, but there was really no way for them to get out of their social status, so they were stuck in this rut. And the scholar by the name of Judge really took this in, and he said that the transfer of cash downwards in the social scale is the main instrument by which the power is asserted. And that was very true. So not only did the rich stay rich, but they gained a higher status because of what they could give. All right? So that gives us kind of a little bit of a knowledge as to the socioeconomics and the social-cultural background of Corinth itself, and maybe why Paul would have addressed some of the topics that he did outside of what was brought to him in earlier questions. So let's really look now into chapter 13 itself. And it begins with this kind of tug of war between spiritual gifts and the idea of love, or the definition of love. And so 3 times in the beginning, Paul says, though I speak with the tongues of men and angels, or have all knowledge and can prophesy, or have everything to give, if I do all that, but I don't love, then I am nothing. I'm just a noisy gong, and I have gained nothing. So it's important to note that there was a juxtaposition there between the spiritual gifts that Paul had stated earlier in his letter. You have these gifts, but what we need to understand is that unity and love are what will bind those things together. So remember, it was his attempt to do away with the divisions, and he was looking for an answer to that. So we see that juxtaposition between the spiritual giftings that they weren't lacking, but the love they were lacking. So let's talk a little bit more about love. In verses 4 through 7 especially, we see, if you don't look at it carefully, you'll miss the timeline and really the relationship that I'm about to bring out. And in verses 4 through 7, we see that love does not envy. But in chapter 3, we read where Paul corrected the Corinthians for their jealousy. Again, love does not boast or is not arrogant, but Paul had corrected them for being self-promoting and puffed up in chapter 4, verse 6, and again in chapter 5 and verse 2. It does not insist on its own way, but in chapters 8 through 10, we read where every seeker or of the Corinthians were definitely looking after their own advantage in their primary options for worship and eating and different things. And then love is not irritable or resentful, yet we see Paul correcting the Corinthians for their shamefulness in chapter 5, verse 2, and then again in chapter 11, verse 4. So, finally, it does not rejoice in wrongdoing, yet Paul recalled that they were easily provoked and reckoners of wrongdoing in chapter 6. So pay very close attention to the wording and what Paul specifically mentions in chapter 13. And as we do that, we'll begin to understand that this wasn't just some praise of love, but Paul was correcting them, and chapter 13 really was meant to solidify those corrections, and Paul wanted to do it with love. That was his antidote for their issues. So lastly, and I'm running out of time, so I want to go quickly, but some of the pros of this are that this method invites us into the world of both the author and the audience, and we get to read through their lens and hear with their ears, which is phenomenal. But the con is when we speak of things as social inequality, or we think about the inequality of their socioeconomic groups, we'll begin to be at risk of reading our own understanding of economics or political economics and throwing that into the text. And we don't want to do that. We want to be able to really pull out what was happening then, not our own definitions. And then lastly, the reflection of love itself. Again, Paul says that love is the antidote, and that makes chapter 13 again kind of a summary of the entire letter, but it really highlights his desire to just do away with the issues and the factions and divisions. And so when you read chapter 13, don't run the risk of thinking of it as a husband and a wife, or even as a boyfriend or girlfriend, or a parent to a child. He was recalling specific things and specific issues that he had already mentioned, and we need to be sure of that. All right, so in a nutshell, that is the social scientific method of interpretation. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and sorry for putting so much into a short video, but hope you guys have a great night. Thank you.